I sat on the porch that evening, staring into the fading light of the California sunset. The air smelled of jasmine from the garden Rachel loved so much. It had been 25 years since we exchanged vows under a similar sky. Back then I was young, foolish, and in love. Now I was older, perhaps wiser, but utterly lost. From the outside, our marriage looked perfect. 2 children, a home in a picturesque neighborhood, and a lifetime of shared memories. Yet, if you peered closely, you'd see the cracks. Rachel had a way of taking control of everything. Our finances, our social life, even my dreams. I had always excused it as her strong personality. But the truth was darker. She controlled me in ways I didn't fully understand until it was too late. It wasn't just the way she dismissed my ideas or made me feel small in front of friends. It was the way she demanded loyalty without offering any in return. Over the years, I had learned to bite my tongue, to survive in the shadows of her moods and whims. She was the queen and I was her loyal subject. That night, she shattered what little was left of the illusion. "I can't do this anymore," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. She was packing a suitcase, each motion deliberate and precise. "I need something different, something exciting. You've become predictable." Predictable. The word struck me like a bullet. After everything I had sacrificed for her, after years of being the rock that held our family together, she called me predictable. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her see what she was leaving behind. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there silent, watching her pack away 25 years of our lives as if it were nothing more than old clothes. "Where are you going?" I finally asked, my voice cracking. "To live," she replied, zipping up the suitcase. "Don't bother calling. I'll send someone for the rest of my things." And just like that, she was gone. I didn't cry that night, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I couldn't afford to. My mind was already spinning, replaying every fight, every insult, every moment I had swallowed my pride to keep her happy. I thought about the secret I had kept for so long, $25 million, hidden in investments, growing quietly, untouched by her controlling grasp. She thought she had won. She thought she was leaving a defeated man. But she was wrong. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. The morning after Rachel left, the house felt emptier than ever. Not just physically, though the absence of her things was noticeable, but emotionally. The silence was deafening. For 25 years, I had lived in a world dictated by her rules, her needs, her desires. Now it was just me, surrounded by the remnants of a life I wasn't sure had ever truly been mine. I didn't tell anyone she was gone. Our children, now adults living their own lives, didn't need to know. Not yet. Instead, I spent the next few days going through the motions. Coffee in the morning, the same chair at the dining table, and long, hollow evenings in front of the TV. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. Rachel's parting words haunted me. "You've become predictable." Predictable. It was a label I had never thought to question. I had built my life on stability, on providing, on enduring. But now, that word twisted in my mind, mocking me, daring me to prove her wrong. And then, one evening, as I sat in the dim light of the study, I opened the hidden safe behind the bookshelf. Inside lay the documents that represented my secret triumph. $25 million, tucked away in accounts she never knew existed. It had started as a small investment in a tech startup a decade and a half ago, something I had done on a whim during one of her tirades about my lack of ambition. That investment had exploded, multiplying over the years. But I had never told her. Why? Perhaps because, deep down, I knew she would find a way to take control of it, just like she had everything else. For years, I had told myself the money was my safety net. Now it felt like a weapon. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I planned. I thought about every insult, every manipulation, every time she had belittled me in front of others. Rachel had left me because she believed I was weak. She had underestimated me. That was her first mistake. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I wouldn't let her win. But I wouldn't confront her directly. That was too simple, too impulsive. No, I would play the long game. She had built her life on control and appearances, and I would take that away from her piece by piece, until there was nothing left. I spent the next few days researching. Rachel's new life wasn't hard to find. She hadn't been subtle about her departure. Social media painted the picture of a woman reborn. Dinners at upscale restaurants, weekends at luxury resorts, and, of course, her new lover, Zachary Moore. He was younger, handsome in a cheap kind of way, and, from what I could gather, reckless with money. Perfect. The first step in my plan was simple: gain access to Zachary's world. I used a shell corporation to approach him with an offer that seemed too good to be true. A silent partnership in a struggling real estate venture he was desperate to save. The terms were strict but enticing, and, predictably, he jumped at the chance. As I signed the final paperwork under a false name, I couldn't help but smirk. Zachary had no idea what he had just walked into, and Rachel, well, she had no idea who she had left behind. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming myself, about proving that I was more than the man she had tried to make me. For the first time in years, I felt alive. It didn't take long for Zachary to reveal just how unprepared he was for the storm I was about to unleash. He was charming but reckless, the kind of man who spent more time talking about success than achieving it. His real estate venture was a patchwork of bad deals and worse decisions, held together by borrowed money and blind optimism. And now, thanks to my investment, it was also held together by my terms. Terms he didn't fully comprehend. Through my shell corporation, I became a silent partner with just enough control to monitor every move Zach made. At first, I played the role of the supportive investor, feeding his ego and encouraging his most ambitious plans. But beneath the surface, I was setting traps. Rachel, of course, was oblivious to all of this. On social media, she flaunted her new life with Zach. Photos of them at rooftop bars, selfies from expensive vacations, captions about freedom and rediscovering herself. It was sickening, really, how easily she had replaced 25 years of marriage with Instagram filters and shallow grins. But I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is a blunt weapon. I needed precision. The first crack appeared when I suggested Zach expand his business into a new city. A risky move, but one that promised huge rewards. He jumped at the idea, funneling money into the project without hesitation. What he didn't know was that I had already made arrangements with key suppliers to delay shipments and increase costs, citing vague supply chain issues. Zach's cash flow dried up within weeks. He started borrowing more, reaching out to other investors to cover his losses. But those investors, as it happened, were also connected to me. Every move he made led him further into my web, and every lifeline he grabbed only tightened the noose. Rachel began to notice the strain. She stopped posting pictures as often. Her captions grew shorter, less enthusiastic. One day, I saw a photo of her and Zach at a small, local restaurant. Not the kind of place she would have chosen a month ago. The image told me everything I needed to know. Still, I wasn't ready to strike. The beauty of revenge lies in its patience. I wanted Rachel to feel the walls closing in, to see the life she had built with Zach crumble around her, piece by piece. It was around this time that she called me. "Michael," she said, her voice carefully measured. "I know it's been a while, but I thought we could talk." I almost laughed. The audacity of her tone, as if she were the victim. "Talk about what?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. I think we left things on bad terms. Maybe we could." "Rachel," I interrupted. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss." There was a pause, just long enough for me to picture her fuming on the other end of the line. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp now. "I was trying to be civil." "Of course you were," I said and hung up. The call confirmed what I had suspected. She was starting to feel the pressure. It wouldn't be long before she came crawling back, desperate for the stability she had thrown away. But I wasn't done yet. There was still more for her to lose. The next step in my plan was simple but devastating. Using my connections, I quietly leaked information about Zach's financial troubles to a few key clients and partners. Within days, his reputation was in tatters. Deals fell through, creditors began calling, and the last of his investors pulled out. The final blow came when I bought out his largest property, through yet another shell corporation, at a fraction of its value. The property had been his pride and joy, the centerpiece of his business. Losing it destroyed what little confidence he had left. And through it all, I watched Rachel. I watched her try to hold things together, to smile through the chaos, to pretend that she hadn't made the biggest mistake of her life. But the cracks were showing, and soon everything would shatter. It was a Friday evening when I saw the first public signs of their downfall. Rachel's carefully curated social media persona began to slip. The polished photos of expensive dinners and romantic getaways were replaced by vague, melancholic posts, sunsets with cryptic captions like, "Sometimes life takes unexpected turns." It was almost laughable. She had spent years controlling every narrative, every perception, and now, reality was clawing through her facade. Zach, on the other hand, had gone quiet entirely. His name had started appearing in local business forums, but not in the way he would have wanted. Words like defaulted, mismanagement, and foreclosure began circulating. His investors were pulling out faster than he could plead for second chances, and his staff, those who hadn't already been let go, were leaking stories to the press about unpaid wages and toxic leadership. Meanwhile, I stayed in the shadows, orchestrating their demise with cold precision. I wasn't just tearing them apart, I was erasing them. Rachel's call came late that night. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling. It was the first time in years I'd heard genuine vulnerability in her tone. "I need to talk to you, please." I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. "Rachel," I said, feigning concern, "is everything all right?" There was a long pause. Then, a quiet sob. "It's Zach. He's losing everything. I don't know what to do." The irony was almost too delicious. The woman who had called me predictable was now begging for my help because the exciting man she left me for was crumbling under the weight of his own incompetence. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, my voice carefully neutral. "But I'm not sure how I can help." "Michael," she said, her voice breaking, "please, I know I hurt you. I know I made mistakes. But we've been through so much together. I don't have anyone else to turn to." For a moment, I let her words hang in the air. The silence was heavy, charged with all the pain and anger she had inflicted on me over the years. Then I spoke. "Rachel," I said, my voice cold now, "you made it very clear that you wanted a new life. I suggest you figure out how to handle it." Before she could respond, I hung up. I thought the call would leave me feeling triumphant, but instead, it left me hollow. As much as I had relished the idea of watching her suffer, there was a part of me, buried deep, but still there, that mourned for the love we had once shared. Or perhaps it mourned the man I had been before she twisted me into this. But there was no turning back now. The plan was in motion, and it was nearing its climax. The next day, I made my final move. Through one of my shell corporations, I purchased the last remaining asset Zach had been clinging to, a modest commercial property that had been his first big break in real estate. The deal was simple and ruthless. He got just enough to settle his immediate debts, but nothing more. It was the nail in the coffin. A week later, I heard that Zach had moved out of their shared apartment. Rachel had tried to keep it quiet, but whispers of their split began circulating among her friends. She had bet everything on him, and now she was left with nothing. I should have felt victorious. I had done what I set out to do. I had dismantled her life piece by piece. But as I sat alone in my study that night, staring at the stack of papers that represented her ruin, I felt something I hadn't expected: emptiness. The woman I had loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who had hurt me in ways I could barely articulate. And now, I had become a stranger to myself, consumed by revenge. Still, I wasn't finished yet. There was one final message I needed to send. Rachel hadn't just lost Zach. She had lost her foundation. The life she had so meticulously built, founded on appearances, control, and manipulation, was crumbling. I knew this because I made sure to watch every piece of it fall. It started with the calls. Rachel began reaching out to old friends, people she had discarded over the years when they no longer served her ambitions. But bridges burned in arrogance are not easily rebuilt. One by one, those friends turned her away, offering polite excuses or outright silence. She had spent years climbing a social ladder only to find herself, now at the bottom rung, alone. I knew she'd try to reach out to our children next. And she did. Anna, our eldest, called me one evening, sounding confused and concerned. "Dad," she said, "Mom's been calling me non-stop. She sounds off." "What's she saying?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "She keeps apologizing, saying she's made mistakes and that she wants to reconnect." Anna paused. "But it doesn't feel real, you know? It feels like she just wants something." I swallowed the knot in my throat. Anna was right. Rachel didn't know how to apologize, not sincerely, at least. Her words were always calculated, designed to extract sympathy or favor. "Do what feels right," I told Anna. "But don't let her manipulate you." It hurt to say those words, to paint the mother of my children in such a light. But it was the truth, and they deserved to know it. Meanwhile, I continued to dismantle what remained of Rachel's financial stability. She had no idea that the modest house she had moved into after our divorce was owned by a holding company under my control. It had been part of a larger portfolio purchase, something I had arranged months before our separation. At the time, it had been a strategic investment. Now it was leverage. I sent her a letter, formal, cold, and legal. The property was being sold, and she had 30 days to vacate. I didn't include my name, of course. That would come later. When she called me again, I let it go to voicemail. "Michael, please." Her voice cracked. "I don't know what's happening. Everything's falling apart. I don't have anywhere to go. I made mistakes, I know that. But please, I need your help." I listened to the message twice, each word striking a different chord in me. The part of me that still carried the scars of her cruelty wanted to delete it and never look back. But another part, a part one didn't want to acknowledge, felt the faintest twinge of pity. The next morning I went to see her, not out of mercy, but because I needed to look her in the eye, to see for myself the consequences of the choices she had made. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. The confident, polished woman I had once married was gone. In her place stood someone smaller, frilier, with dark circles under her eyes and a tremor in her voice. "Michael," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel," I replied, stepping inside. The house was sparse, its walls bare, its furniture cheap and mismatched. She gestured for me to sit, and we faced each other across a wobbly coffee table. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, she broke the silence. "I know I hurt you," she said, her eyes filling with tears. I thought I wanted freedom, but all I've done is destroy everything. Zach is gone, the money's gone, and now—" She trailed off, gesturing weakly around her. I said nothing, letting the weight of her words settle. "I don't know how to fix this," she continued. "I don't even know where to start. I need help, Michael. Please." It was the apology I had waited years to hear, and yet it brought me no satisfaction. "I can't help you, Rachel," I said finally, my voice steady but firm. "Not anymore. You made your choice, and now you have to live with it." She looked at me, stunned, as if she hadn't truly believed I would refuse her. As I left, I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a cold, empty resolve. I had begun this journey seeking justice, but now I wondered if I had become the very thing I despised. And yet I wasn't finished. After our meeting, I expected Rachel to retreat into silence. Instead, she became more desperate. Over the next few weeks, she called repeatedly, leaving voicemails filled with pleas and half-hearted apologies. Each one chipped away at the icy resolve I had built around myself, but I refused to answer. Her downfall wasn't just financial, it was social. The friends she had once flaunted had all but vanished, unwilling to associate with someone in freefall. Word of Zach's failures had spread quickly, and by extension, Rachel's reputation as his partner had been tarnished. But Rachel wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. True to her nature, she fought back in the only way she knew, by trying to regain control. One evening, she showed up at my door unannounced. The sight of her was both shocking and pitiful. Her once pristine appearance was disheveled, her eyes hollow with exhaustion. She looked like someone clinging to the edge of a cliff. "Michael," she began, her voice shaking, "I know you're angry. I know I hurt you, but I can't do this alone. Please, for the sake of everything we shared, help me." I stared at her, my emotions warring between pity and rage. She had built this narrative in her mind. A story where I was still the man who would clean up her messes, the man she could manipulate. But I wasn't that man anymore. "Rachel," I said, keeping my voice calm, "you left me. You didn't just walk away from our marriage, you burned it to the ground. And now you want me to save you." Her face crumpled, but I didn't stop. "You didn't want me when things were stable. You wanted chaos, excitement. Well, now you have it." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but I felt no satisfaction in seeing her break. "I thought you loved me," she whispered. "I did," I said, my voice cold. "But the person I loved died a long time ago." She stood there for a moment, as if waiting for me to take back my words. When I didn't, she turned and left without another word. I closed the door, leaning against it as the weight of the encounter settled over me. I should have felt triumphant. This was what I had wanted, wasn't it? To see her humbled, broken, begging for my forgiveness? But instead, I felt emptier than ever. Over the next few days, I threw myself into work, trying to ignore the gnawing unease that had taken root inside me. But then, something happened that shifted everything. One afternoon, I received a call from Anna. "Dad," she said, her voice tense. "Mom's in the hospital." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What happened?" I asked, my throat tightening. "She collapsed," Anna said. "Stress, malnutrition. They said she's been neglecting herself." She didn't even call anyone. Someone found her in the parking lot of a grocery store. I was silent, the weight of her words sinking in. "Dad," Anna continued, her voice softer now, "you should go see her." I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell Anna that Rachel's choices were her own, that she didn't deserve my pity or my help. But deep down, I knew I couldn't. That evening, I sat in the sterile quiet of the hospital, staring at the fragile figure lying in the bed. This wasn't the Rachel I had spent years resenting. This was a shadow of her, a broken version of the woman I had once loved. She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze meeting mine. For a moment, there was no anger, no bitterness, just raw vulnerability. "Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond. I just sat there, the weight of everything between us pressing down on my chest. This wasn't the end of the story, far from it. But for the first time, I began to wonder if revenge was worth the price I was paying. The hospital room was oppressively quiet, broken only by the faint hum of medical equipment. I sat there, watching her fragile frame rise and fall with shallow breaths. Rachel was no longer the domineering, vibrant woman I had known for decades. She was a husk of herself, pale, worn, and frighteningly vulnerable. For the first time in months, I felt no anger. Sitting there, I realized I wasn't looking at my tormentor or the person who betrayed me. I was looking at someone who was lost, a person who had unraveled under the weight of her own choices. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I don't know," I admitted, and it was the truth. For the next hour, neither of us spoke. I sat by her bed as she drifted in and out of sleep. The silence was heavy with unspoken words. Apologies never made, wounds never healed. I thought about leaving, about walking away and letting her face the consequences alone. But something rooted me there. The following days blurred together. Rachel was discharged and returned to her barren apartment, and against my better judgment, I kept checking in. I wasn't sure why I did it. Guilt? Obligation? Perhaps a part of me simply needed to see her crumble entirely before I could let go. When I arrived at her apartment a few days later, she was sitting on the couch, staring at the wall. The sight of her like that, a woman who had once dominated every room she entered, now reduced to this, gnawed at me in ways I didn't understand. "Michael," she said as I set a bag of groceries on the counter. Her voice was softer now, stripped of the sharpness that had defined her for so long. "Why are you helping me?" "I don't know," I said again, but this time it wasn't entirely true. I did know, at least in part. Despite everything she had done, despite all the pain and betrayal, there was a part of me that still cared. Or maybe I cared about the version of her I had once believed in. She nodded, as if accepting my answer, and turned back to the wall. Over the next few weeks, I found myself grappling with questions I hadn't allowed myself to ask before. What did I hope to gain from all of this? Revenge had consumed me for so long that I had never stopped to consider what came after. Now, as I watched Rachel struggle to rebuild herself, I began to feel the weight of my actions. I thought about the choices that had brought us here, hers and mine. Rachel had betrayed me, yes, but had I ever truly stood up for myself during our marriage? Had my silence, my passivity, enabled her to become the person she was? One evening, as we sat in her apartment, an uneasy truce between us, she broke the silence. "I was wrong," she said, her voice trembling, "about everything. I thought I wanted something more, something better. But all I did was destroy the only thing that mattered." I didn't respond right away. The words I had wanted to hear for so long now felt hollow. "I don't think I can fix this," she continued, tears welling in her eyes. "Not with you, not with anyone." For the first time, I saw Rachel for who she truly was. Not the manipulative, controlling woman I had resented, but someone deeply flawed, broken, and searching for redemption. And for the first time, I began to question if my revenge had gone too far. Rachel's words haunted me long after I left her apartment that night. "I don't think I can fix this." They echoed in my mind, refusing to be silenced. I had achieved everything I set out to do. Her life was in ruins, her pride shattered, her confidence eroded. But instead of the satisfaction I had expected, I felt a growing unease, a gnawing sense of doubt. I had spent so much time focused on dismantling her world that I hadn't stopped to consider the collateral damage. My children, Anna and Luke, were caught in the crossfire, forced to navigate the fractured relationship between their parents. And Rachel, as much as I had convinced myself that she deserved every ounce of pain, there was something unsettling about seeing her like this. One evening, Anna called again. "Dad," she said, her tone cautious, "can we talk?" "Of course," I replied, though I already sensed where this was going. "It's about Mom," she began. "I know what she did to you was awful, and I'm not excusing it. But she's not okay. I don't think she can handle this alone." "Anna," I said, my voice steady, "your mother made her choices. She decided to leave. She decided to—" I trailed off, the bitterness still too sharp to articulate. "I know," Anna said, "but she's still Mom. And no matter what, I don't want to lose her." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Anna had always been the peacemaker, the one who tried to find balance in the chaos. And now, she was asking me to do something I wasn't sure I was capable of, letting go of my anger. The next day, I found myself driving to Rachel's apartment again. I hadn't planned to go, but something about Anna's plea had unsettled me. When I arrived, I found Rachel sitting at the small table by the window, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. "Michael," she said, surprised to see me. "I wanted to talk," I said, sitting across from her. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy, filled with the weight of years of unresolved pain. Finally, I broke it. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice steady but demanding. "Why did you leave?" She looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling slightly. "I thought I was trapped," she said quietly. "Trapped in a life that didn't feel like mine anymore. I wanted, I don't know, freedom, excitement, something different." Her honesty caught me off guard. For years, I had painted her as a villain, someone who had betrayed me out of malice. But now, hearing her speak, I realized her actions had been driven by fear and insecurity as much as selfishness. "And Zach," pressed. She laughed bitterly. "He was a fantasy, a way to escape, but he was never real. None of it was." The admission hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. "I hurt you," she continued, her voice breaking. "I know that, and I've paid for it. Every day I live with the consequences of what I did. But if I could take it back, if I could fix it." Her voice trailed off, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in her eyes. That night, I sat alone in my study, replaying our conversation over and over. For so long, I had convinced myself that Rachel deserved everything I had done to her. But now I wasn't so sure. Revenge had consumed me, defined me, but it hadn't healed me. If anything, it had left me emptier than before. And as I sat there, staring at the stack of legal documents that had orchestrated her downfall, I began to wonder if it was time to let go. The question lingered in my mind, heavy and unanswerable. What kind of man do I want to be now? The next few days were a blur. I spent my time going through the motions, work, meetings, phone calls, but my mind was elsewhere, constantly returning to the conversation with Rachel. It was like a wound I had been ignoring for years suddenly reopened, and no matter how much I tried to numb the pain, it wouldn't stop bleeding. I had set out on this path because I thought I deserved justice, that my suffering at her hands warranted retribution. I had made her pay, forced her into a position of powerlessness, and yet, with every step I took toward her ruin, I had unknowingly destroyed pieces of myself. I remembered the years we had spent together, the laughter, the love, the quiet moments when it felt like we could conquer anything. There were times when I had genuinely believed she was the person I was meant to be with forever. But somewhere along the way she had changed, and so had I. We both had. And now, sitting in the sterile silence of my office, I realized I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore. I had won, by all accounts I had gotten what I had been chasing, but the victory tasted bitter. It was around this time that I received a call from Anna. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "Mom's gone. She left." For a moment, I didn't understand what she meant. "What do you mean, gone?" She packed up and left. I don't know where she went, but she's gone." I felt a pang in my chest, but I didn't know how to respond. I had done everything I could to push her away. Wasn't this what I wanted? But something about it didn't feel right. The finality of it struck me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had spent years wishing for her to feel the pain she had caused me, but now that she was truly gone, I found myself struggling to breathe. The days that followed were a blur of unanswered calls and growing confusion. Anna was worried, but I wasn't sure how to reassure her. I didn't even know where Rachel had gone, and the thought that she had simply disappeared into the night, a ghost of the woman she used to be, haunted me. It wasn't until a week later that I received another phone call. This time it wasn't from Anna, it was from a detective. "Mr. Taylor," the voice on the other end said, "I'm afraid we've found your ex-wife." I froze. "What do you mean?" "There's been an incident. We found her in a motel. She's—" The detective hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "She's in critical condition. We don't know how it happened, but she's been hospitalized." The world seemed to tilt beneath me. I barely registered the rest of what the detective said. All I could think about was the woman I had spent years resenting, who had now been reduced to this, alone and broken, her choices having led her to this moment of devastation. I hung up the phone without saying goodbye, my heart pounding in my chest. I drove to the hospital as fast as I could, my thoughts a whirlwind. I hadn't seen Rachel in days, and I wasn't sure what I would find when I arrived. Was this my doing? Had my actions, my pursuit of revenge, pushed her this far? Was this the cost of everything I had set in motion? When I walked into the sterile room, the smell of antiseptic heavy in the air, I found her unconscious, hooked up to machines that beeped with the rhythm of life. She was frail, her once flawless skin pale and drawn. There were no words to describe the devastation I felt. This wasn't a victory. This wasn't justice. I stood by her bed, unsure of what to do. I had destroyed her once, but this felt like a different kind of destruction. Her condition remained critical for days, and during that time, I found myself visiting the hospital every night. I watched as the woman who had once been everything to me fought for her life, though in my heart, I wasn't sure if she was fighting for redemption or simply for survival. I thought back to what she had said when we spoke last. If I could take it back. Her regret had been genuine, her sorrow unmistakable. But I didn't know if it was enough. Could it ever be enough? The days dragged on. I continued to wrestle with myself, questioning the path I had chosen. I had taken so much from her, but had I taken too much? My mind swirled with guilt, resentment, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. What kind of person had I become? What kind of person was I now? As the days passed, I began to realize that I could not undo what had been done. Rachel's fate, her suffering, was the result of both her choices and mine. But I didn't have to keep this cycle going. I didn't have to keep punishing her or myself. I wasn't sure what the future would hold for Rachel or me. But as I stood in that hospital room, watching her struggle to regain her strength, I made a decision. It wasn't about forgiveness, it wasn't about absolution. It was about accepting that both of us had been broken by the same circumstances, and it was time to heal. Rachel's recovery was slow, agonizingly so. Each day I sat by her bedside, I watched her fight. Physically, yes, but emotionally too. I could see the guilt in her eyes when she looked at me, the silent apology that lingered in every glance. But her recovery was more than just about her physical health. It was about her soul, the part of her that had been so lost and desperate. For the first time in a long while, I found myself questioning everything I had believed about her, about us. Had I been too quick to condemn her? Had I destroyed her, not because of her betrayal, but because I couldn't let go of my own anger? I had prided myself on being strong, on being the one in control. But the truth was, I was just as lost as she was, buried under layers of pain and regret. She wasn't the only one who had made mistakes. I had been so caught up in getting even that I had failed to see how far I had fallen from who I once was. I spent hours at the hospital, sometimes sitting in silence, other times reading to her. But each moment felt like a battle. The woman who had once been my partner was now a stranger. She was fragile, broken, and I wasn't sure if I could ever rebuild what we had, or if I even wanted to. One evening, as I sat by her bed, Rachel finally spoke. Her voice was weak, barely above a whisper, but the words cut through the stillness of the room like a knife. "Michael," she said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." The words I had been waiting to hear for so long were finally coming from her mouth, but they didn't bring the relief I had expected. Instead, they only deepened the ache I felt inside. "I hurt you. I hurt our family," she continued, her voice cracking, "and I don't think I'll ever be able to fix it. But if you can forgive me, even a little, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right." Her words hung in the air between us, and for a long time, I said nothing. I didn't know what to say. Could I forgive her? Could I forgive myself? Did either of us even deserve forgiveness? I had spent so many years holding on to my anger, thinking that it was the only thing that could protect me. But now, in this moment, I realized that my anger had become my prison. It had kept me chained to the past, unable to move forward. I had built my revenge around the idea of justice, but what I hadn't considered was that justice, true justice, was not about causing pain, it was about healing. It was about letting go. Days passed, and Rachel began to regain some strength, though she remained frail. Our conversations grew more frequent, less strained. I could see in her eyes the effort it took for her to own up to the things she had done wrong. And though I still felt the sting of everything she had put me through, I couldn't help but wonder if this was a chance for both of us to heal. But healing wasn't simple. It wasn't something that could be achieved overnight, and it certainly couldn't be achieved through words alone. I needed to forgive her, but I also needed to forgive myself. I had spent so much time focusing on the wounds she had inflicted on me that I had neglected the damage I had done to myself. I decided that I couldn't stay in the past any longer. I couldn't keep clinging to old grudges, old anger. I had to move forward, and that meant making peace with everything that had happened. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Anna. It was simple, but it carried more weight than anything I had heard from her in years. "Dad, I know things have been hard for all of us, but I think you're doing the right thing. I'm proud of you for trying to make peace with Mom. I think it's time for all of us to start over, together." The words hit me harder than I expected. Anna had been the bridge between Rachel and me, even when we didn't see it. She had never stopped hoping for a resolution, even when I had given up. That night, I went back to Rachel's apartment. She was sitting in the same chair by the window, staring out into the night. When she saw me, she didn't speak at first. But this time, there was no tension between us, no animosity. I sat down beside her, unsure of what to say. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between us now, a sense that we had both been through something that couldn't be undone but could be forgiven. "I'm not sure we can ever go back," I said finally, my voice quiet. "But maybe we don't need to." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of something else, hope maybe. "I don't need you to forgive me right away," she whispered. "But I want to try. I want to try to be better." And for the first time in years, I believed her. As I walked away from Rachel's apartment that night, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, but I knew that whatever it was, I couldn't keep living in the shadow of the past. The pain, the betrayal, the revenge, it had all shaped me, but it didn't have to define me. In the end, forgiveness wasn't about excusing what had happened. It was about letting go. It was about freeing myself from the weight of all the years I had spent holding on to the past. Maybe Rachel and I couldn't rebuild everything we had lost. But maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward, separately or together. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet reckoning. My life, once filled with the sharp edges of revenge and bitterness, slowly began to smooth over, though the scars still lingered beneath the surface. I had made my peace with Rachel, or at least I was trying to. We spoke occasionally, but the words between us were fewer and farther between, as if we both understood that our relationship could never be what it once was. It was something else now, an uneasy truce, fragile but necessary. I started to realize that my life would never return to the way it had been before. The years of pain, the years of silence and suffering, had irrevocably changed me. The man I had been when I married Rachel was gone, and I was still unsure of who I had become in his place. There were days when I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger staring back at me, a man who had allowed anger to define him, to shape his every decision. But there were also moments when I felt something like freedom. I had spent so much of my life trapped by the ghosts of my past, by the weight of my own bitterness. Now I was learning to let go, learning to move forward. It wasn't easy. It wasn't instantaneous. But every day, I took small steps in a direction I hadn't thought possible. I saw Anna more often, and each time, I could see how the cracks in our family had affected her. But there was a quiet resilience in her, a strength I hadn't fully appreciated until now. Despite everything that had happened, despite the wreckage that had been left in the wake of Rachel's betrayal and my own choices, Anna had managed to find a way to keep going. One afternoon, as we sat in the kitchen of my house, Anna looked at me and asked the question I had been avoiding for months. "Dad," she said softly, "do you think you and Mom will ever be okay?" I took a deep breath, unsure of how to answer. How could I explain to her that I didn't have the answer? That I didn't know if there was an okay for Rachel and me? "I don't know," I said truthfully. "But I do know that we're both trying to be better. Maybe that's enough." Anna nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "Maybe it is," she said quietly. "Maybe it's enough." I spent more time with my children, trying to rebuild what had been broken. I wasn't sure if the scars would ever fully fade, but there were moments, small moments, when I could see glimpses of what we once had. They weren't perfect and the healing wasn't instant, but I was learning that sometimes the best you can do is to keep going, even when it feels like the road is too long, too steep, too broken. Rachel, on the other hand, remained a distant figure in my life. We spoke occasionally, mostly about the kids and sometimes about the past. But each conversation seemed to bring us further apart, not closer. I wasn't sure if we could ever truly be what we once were, but I also wasn't sure if we needed to be. As time went on, I realized something important. Forgiveness isn't about fixing everything. It's about freeing yourself from the chains of resentment and guilt. And I had spent too many years shackled to the past. One evening, as I sat alone in my living room, a thought occurred to me. What if I had never done any of it? What if I had never taken my revenge on Rachel? What would my life look like? The answer was unclear, but I knew one thing for sure. I would have never learned the lessons I did through the pain and the mistakes. I couldn't undo what had been done. I couldn't erase the years of suffering or the bitterness that had clouded my vision. But I could move forward. I could choose to stop being a victim of my past and start being the man I wanted to become. There was no easy way out, no quick fix. Healing takes time, and sometimes it feels like there's no end in sight. But I was learning to be patient with myself. I was learning that sometimes the most important thing is to keep going, even when the future feels uncertain. One day, as I was walking through the park, I ran into Rachel. She was sitting on a bench, looking out at the water. For a moment I hesitated, unsure of whether I should approach her. But something inside me told me to go. I sat down beside her, and for the first time in years, the silence between us wasn't filled with anger or regret. It was simply quiet. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I can never make up for what I did, but I want you to know that I'm sorry." I looked at her for a long time, trying to make sense of everything that had happened between us. I could feel the weight of our history pressing down on me, but I also felt something else, something like acceptance. "You don't have to apologize anymore," I said softly. "We're both trying. That's all that matters now." She nodded, and for a moment, there was peace between us. Not the kind of peace that erases everything, but the kind that acknowledges the past and allows us both to move forward. As I left the park that day, I felt lighter than I had in years. I wasn't sure where the future would take me, or whether Rachel and I could ever truly find our way back to each other. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had taken a step in the right direction. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with questions. But I knew that, for the first time, I was walking it as a man who had learned the cost of his actions, and who was finally ready to embrace whatever came next. Months passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. I didn't expect everything to be perfect, nor did I expect the scars to disappear overnight. But there was a quiet comfort in the mundane moments, an understanding that, though the past would always be a part of me, it no longer had to control me. I spent less time obsessing over what Rachel had done, less time questioning the choices I had made. In the end, it wasn't about seeking vengeance or redemption. It was about finding a way to live with the consequences of our actions and still move forward. The kids were growing older, their lives carrying on as they should. Anna was thriving in college, her life slowly unfolding into something I could never have imagined when things had been at their worst. She didn't ask about her mother much anymore, though I knew she still held a quiet pain from everything that had happened. But she was strong, stronger than I had been at her age, and I could see that she had inherited a resilience from both of us. But my thoughts often returned to Rachel. I couldn't help but wonder where she was, how she was living now. There was a part of me that wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between us completely, but the other part, perhaps the wiser part, knew better. We had both changed so much. I didn't know if there was anything left between us except for the ruins of what we once had. One evening, I decided to take a walk in the city, something I hadn't done in a long time. The streets were lit with the amber glow of streetlights, and the world around me felt alive with possibility. It was in these moments that I felt the weight of the past lift, even if just for a little while. As I walked, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Rachel. "I hope you're well. I've been thinking about everything, about us. I don't know if we'll ever be okay, but I wanted to say thank you for letting me go, for not holding on to the anger anymore. I think we've both finally found our own way." I stared at the message for a long time, my fingers hovering over the keys. I wasn't sure how to respond. But then, something inside me told me that I didn't have to respond. We had both said enough over the years, and the final words didn't need to come from me. I put the phone back in my pocket and kept walking. It was strange, the sense of closure that message gave me, but also freeing. She had found her way, just as I had found mine. And maybe, in the end, that was all we could ask for. A week later, I found myself at a small cafe, the kind of place I used to frequent before everything fell apart. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and the hum of quiet conversation around me reminded me of simpler times. I sat at a table by the window, sipping my coffee, allowing myself a moment of peace. It was there that I met her. Her name was Claire, and she was different from anyone I had met in years. She was quiet, thoughtful, with a presence that was both comforting and intriguing. We spoke briefly, just small talk at first, but there was something about her, something that made me feel seen, not in the way that I had been seen in the past, but in a way that felt like the beginning of something new. For the first time in a long while, I felt the stirring of hope. Not for the future of Rachel and me, but for my own future. For the possibility that I could still build something real, something worth holding on to. Claire and I exchanged numbers before we left, and though I wasn't sure where it would go, I felt a sense of excitement in a way that I hadn't felt in years. There was a lightness to the moment, a promise that the road ahead could still hold something good. As I drove home that night, the streets outside seemed different, more alive. I realized that the weight I had been carrying for so long, the anger, the bitterness, the guilt, it had all begun to fade. I had spent so much of my life trapped by those feelings, but now I was free. The future was uncertain, yes, but that was okay. It wasn't about knowing exactly what would happen next. It was about choosing to move forward, no matter how unsure I felt. And perhaps, for the first time in a long while, I understood what it meant to truly live. Not for revenge, not for retribution, but for myself. I couldn't help but smile as I thought back to everything I had been through. Everything that had brought me here. The pain, the mistakes, the anger, it was all still part of me, but it no longer controlled me. It didn't define me. In the end, I realized that we don't need to have everything figured out. We don't need to have a perfect life. We just need to keep moving forward, even when the road is unclear. Even when it feels like there's no way out. Because sometimes the most important part of the journey is simply taking the next step. As I finished my drive home, a thought lingered in my mind. I had spent so many years trapped in the past, but now I was free. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time I wasn't afraid to find out. If you've been following this journey, you know how important it is to confront your past and make peace with it. Whether it's with yourself, someone else, or the mistakes you've made. The path forward may not always be clear, but the most important thing is that we keep walking. What do you think? Can we truly move past the pain of betrayal, or does it always define us? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about redemption, change, and the endless possibility of the human spirit. Until next time, keep going.